Could you recognize if someone you loved was a victim of abuse or the one causing it? Abuse often lurks in plain sight, camouflaged amidst chaos and drama. It thrives when we close our eyes to the stories we deem too perplexing or overwhelming. This is how victim stories are dismissed, and why we began this work. If I Told You is a project sharing about hidden abuses and concealed horrors happening to unexpected people in unexpected situations. Our team represents their stories to you to help you understand them better through the lens of faith and science. As you listen, we hope you think deeper, listen with compassion, and are pushed to action.
Hey there, listeners. It's Elle, and welcome back to If I Told You. Sometimes the reason your world falls apart, the reason hell opens on your floor, is the very thing you never imagined. Not something you did, not something you caused, but something you never even knew existed. For me, that moment came when I was forced to ask a question I never thought I'd ask. Is my ex an occult? A secret group? A brotherhood, a fraternity, something spiritual and dark that I didn't even have full knowledge of, yet I could not ignore the patterns, the silence, and the spiritual backlash that followed me and my children like a shadow. And worse, this wasn't some obscure foreign group. This was a name many have probably heard of, a network hidden in plain sight, familiar enough to be dismissed, yet ancient enough to be deadly. A system built on domination and deception, designed to groom, control, and abuse. It sounded crazy at first, but I wasn't the only one saying it. I kept running into other women, other stories that mirrored mine, stories that had the same darkness, the same tactics, the same spiritual torment, all pointing back to something larger, more coordinated, and more sinister. Quite often, men in the occult don't come with red flags. Many come with a Bible and a smile. They will quote scripture. They will serve at church. They blend in perfectly, just like Simon the sorcerer in Acts chapter 8. He was part of a church community, and still his heart was full of wickedness. That same spirit is alive today, walking freely through our pulpits, our prayer circles, our homes, unchecked, unchallenged. And so now, I find myself asking questions I never thought I would be forced to face. What is this group? How did he become a part of it? How do I keep my children safe from people who smile yet destroy? What you will hear today is hard to say because the cruelty behind it is beyond words. It's the kind of evil that makes your faith get loud, though, that makes you cry out in tongues and in tears, that makes you ask, why? Only to find out that the answer is not in what you did, but in what someone else aligned themselves with. So stay with me, because today we are peeling back the veil. We're talking about cults, ritual abuse, prophetic warnings, and the moment everything shattered. This is not a story for the faint of heart, but if you are here, I believe something in you is ready to see. Let's begin.
This podcast discusses serious and often distressing topics. If you find yourself in need of support at any time, please contact your local crisis center or reach out to our support resources. For suggested organizations and helplines, check the show notes. And if you feel led, stay with us through the end for a prayer dedicated to victims of crime and abuse.
The kingdom of darkness thrives in shadow. It hides behind confusion, manipulation, deception, and sometimes religion. That's its strategy, to keep the people of God blind, deaf, and disarmed. Because as long as they're fumbling in the dark, they can't see the war they're in, let alone fight back. But God doesn't leave his people weaponless. He sends light, not just the light of salvation. That's only the beginning. He sends the prophetic. Prophecy is the revealed intention of God spoken aloud. His word declared in the presence of his people. When darkness comes in like a flood, the prophetic rises like a standard. Dreams, visions, discernment, deeper hunger for the word. These aren't mystical extras. They are survival tools, heaven's response to hell's assault. And as Elle would soon learn, they were gifts God had already been stirring in her. She just hadn't known how to use them yet. In the spring of 2022, still deep in the confusion of legal battles, hidden abuse, and unrelenting questions, Elle made a decision. She packed a bag and went searching for answers only God could give. What she found was more than a conference. It was an encounter.
So, in the spring of 2022, I attended a prophetic conference. The only reason I went was to get answers about what was happening in this case. I didn't know anyone there, and honestly, I didn't care. I brought a picture of my children, my Bible, and my questions written out. I prayed, God, show me what I need to see. Lead me to who I need to meet. And from the moment I arrived, it began. A petite woman with an accent walked up to me and said, "You have been in a time of great trial, but your children and you will see God move. Wait, just wait." I want you to take note. I had not even introduced myself to her, and of course had not told her I was previously married or had children. Another person came to me and said, "The Lord is showing me that you were married to a man who has turned to darkness. I can see him sitting on a chair, surrounded by 5 men. They all look like brothers. They all look alike." One after another, strangers approached me. Some were crying as they spoke. It's unspeakable what the Lord is showing me," one woman said. And then another would say, "But God will bring you justice. May the Lord bless you for your strength." I cannot describe the feeling of hearing people, strangers, articulate the very things that I had been living but could not explain to those in my community at home. For years, I had been someone who dreamt often, who heard from the Lord. But in a way, I always felt discouraged from really leaning into that. I think many believers love Jesus, but really have no concept of what it means to engage spiritually with him. So when I would talk about hearing dreams or having visions or hearing from the Lord, I often met people who just could not relate or thought it was just something washed up from scripture. It always felt like I had to silence myself or explain what seemed to come naturally to me. But here at this conference, I saw myself and others for the first time. People who got it, who understood the prophetic, who also had dreams, who sat in the Word until they could find answers and could see the same things in the Spirit that the Lord was also showing me. It felt like I had stepped into a room full of mirrors, and instead of being misunderstood, I was seen. These weren't just emotional affirmations, they were confirmations, and they gave me the strength to keep going. Midweek during the conference, during one of the prayer sessions, I found myself crying out to the Lord again. There was still so much I didn't understand, so much that I needed clarity on. And in that moment, I quietly prayed, "Lord, if you could just get me a minute with one of the ministers. I just need a moment with them for insight and direction." At that very same time, a group of the ministers began moving towards my section to a group of women behind me who had been praying in the Spirit. As they approached them, suddenly the group paused right in front of me. And the very minister who I had just asked the Lord about was now standing right in front of me. Reflecting back on it, I almost couldn't believe it. I seized the moment. I opened my mouth and the question that had been burning in me tumbled out. What do you call it when there's potential child abuse, a sudden divorce, evading legal consequences? I mean, I know about Leviathan and Baal, but is there something else to this? She tilted her head and she said, "That sounds like Freemasonry." I looked down and I immediately said, "No, I doubt it. We're African. I don't think we do that." She looked back at me and smiled, tilted her head and said, "Well, maybe you should take another look." The next day, another woman gently referred a book to me. She said, "What you're going through, I think this book might help explain." I nodded politely and I tucked the reference in my notes, but I was still skeptical. But there was something in her voice that held a kind of knowing, the kind that you don't forget. And honestly, there was something in that moment that shifted for me. Because once you start asking the right questions, you can't unsee the answers. But after the conference, I didn't even have time to process everything I had just experienced, because I came home to chaos. It was the kids' spring break, and their father had taken them out of state without any heads up and no prior notice at all. The shock of it had hit me like a wave, knocking everything else out of my mind. All of the clarity, the insight, the spiritual grounding I had just received vanished under the weight of the emergency unfolding right in front of me. It was like finally finding something you have been desperately searching for, only to have it snatched from your hands the moment you need it most. Looking back, I see now that this would be a tactic, a pattern the enemy would use disruption, shock, and crisis to steal my focus and shake my foundation. If they, whether the enemy or an abuser, could keep me in a constant state of reaction, I wouldn't just be distracted, I'd lose ground, I would lose belief. And here's the thing, when someone takes your children, of course you're going to respond. You're supposed to, and I did. And that was also part of the trap. Because the moment I reacted, the system, his network, would move to neutralize it. They downplayed it. He's probably just trying to get your attention. They would stall with red tape. Well, it will cost you money if you really want to file a motion. They would use delay, denial, and deflection to smother any consequence for him and left me looking like the problem for trying to do something about it. It was a double bind. If I reacted, I looked unstable. If I didn't, he just kept crossing the line further and more boldly. Either way, I would lose ground, and either way, they didn't hold him accountable. So how do you win when both action and inaction are turned against you? This is the torment that many people facing hidden abuse live with daily. This double bind, this impossible tension, it's not just psychological, it is intentional warfare. I want you to remember this pattern because it is how the enemy tries to keep people silent, confused, and afraid. But something would bring my attention back to what God was trying to uncover during that conference. I began having a series of dreams that were vivid and unsettling. I knew they weren't just dreams, they were revelation. God was trying to show me something, and I couldn't yet see it with my natural eyes. The dream that stood out the most at that time was this. On July 2nd, 2022, I had a dream that began with me taking a sharp gasp for air, as if I had just woken up inside the scene itself. My two older children were asleep in the bed next to me. I was sitting in a chair. Instinctively, I wanted to grab both of them and pick them up and run out the door. But I said it will be heavy to carry them while they're sleeping, so let me wait for them to wake up before we head out. A few seconds later, I would take a walk around the floor and then I would come back to the room to check on my children. When I came back, I saw that my ex was at the base of their bed. When he looked at me, he reached for a hug. Just as he leaned in, he stopped and broke into tears and said, "Look at what they made me do. They cut my chest. They did this to my shirt." He said, "It's not fair," then made this high-pitched, strange, babyish whining sound, something that was so distinct and unsettling that it lingered with me even after I woke up. In the dream, his dress shirt was ripped at the collar and cut in between each button. The fabric between the buttons had been tied into small knots, as if someone was trying to hide the fact that it had been deliberately slashed. Through his shirt, I could see that there was a sharp, caliper-like object piercing his left nipple. Then I woke up. Now, what did all that mean? I took the day to fast and pray for understanding. The fact that I woke up into the dream wasn't lost on me. It symbolized that God was showing me that I had been asleep to a truth in real life, and now it was time to wake up to what was happening. The torn shirt that my ex was wearing symbolized a tearing of his mantle, his identity, but also most simplistically, it was a tearing away of something that covered him. And whatever happened was violent and purposeful. But who tore it? And what exactly was piercing his left chest?
Elle had just received a major clue: Freemasonry, a word that unlocked a door she didn't even know was there. But God wasn't done. Because when he wants to expose what's been hidden, he doesn't just speak through people. He releases revelation through his word and through divine intelligence, like dreams. Her next dream wasn't ordinary. It was a turning point, a holy interruption. When God gives you a dream, how do you treat it? Do you brush it off? Or do you listen for what he's trying to say? Elle couldn't afford to ignore anything now. And when we learn to pay attention to God's clues, we often find ourselves stumbling into the very answers we've been desperate to reach.
On that day that I started praying and fasting about the dreams, the Lord immediately redirected my attention back to the book that the woman suggested to me from the conference. Now, I had forgotten about it and had forgotten that it was about Freemasonry. I had no idea what that really was. I had heard the name, but had never really paid much attention to it. But this book had laid it all bare. It explained the levels, the rituals, the initiations, and the curses that came with them. In the first level alone, I read something that made my entire body stand still. Initiates were forced to change their clothing, and a sharp object was pierced through the man's left breast. I went back to read the journal entry in my dream journal, and noticing that my ex had something sharp piercing his left breast. I could not make this up if I tried. There are no coincidences. In the book, it goes on to say, Freemasonry initiations are humiliating affairs. All metal objects are removed, including any wedding ring. The shirt is unbuttoned to expose the left breast. The reason this is done is to ensure the candidate is a male, for no female is permitted to participate in the rituals in most lodges. The right sleeve is rolled up to above the elbow, and the left trouser leg is rolled up above the knee, and the right shoe is removed and replaced with a slipper. A rope noose called a cable toe is placed around the neck, and the initiate is blindfolded. This blindfold is called a hoodwink. He is introduced by an officer called the Tyler as a poor candidate in a state of darkness. There is also a small ritual dagger called a poignard, which pricks the left breast and is aimed at the man's heart, empowering an evil blood covenant. As I'm reading this, I'm just thinking, I didn't even know what Freemasonry was. So the fact that I had a dream about this, I knew that the Lord was giving me divine intelligence. It was like the Lord had left a breadcrumb trail, one that I didn't even know that I was following. I kept reading. The author explained how each level of Freemasonry came with specific curses. Listen to the ones from the first level. Breaks in marriage, breaks in communication, ruined families and marriages, continual rejection by others, fear of heart attacks, fear of death or stabbing, a hard heart, spiritual blindness. Since 2021, we had already experienced the first four. The marriage broke, communication completely ceased, he had stopped speaking to me, relationships with people around me would collapse overnight as if a cord had been cut, rejection, silence, abandonment, all of it. And now I was staring at this page and realizing that none of this had been random. This was not normal. This was Freemasonry. I put the book down and thought to myself, the pastor at the conference was right. This was Freemasonry. I had asked the Lord to show me what I was dealing with, and he answered, not in the way I expected, not with something soft or easy, but with truth, a truth I had once dismissed when it was first mentioned. The book continued. It explained how men were often brought into this cult, not with open evil, but with charm, gifts, a favor. Some were told it was a Christian brotherhood. Others believed it was a networking group for businessmen or a charitable society. But by the time they would find out what it really was, they would be in too deep. And once inside, the brotherhood was about protecting each other. If someone needed an out, if one faced a charge or a crime, the others would show up for them. They would band together to protect their quote-unquote brother. Now, imagine committing a crime, but knowing you would walk free. Suddenly, the brazenness of his confidence from before made sense. The confidence, the smugness. If you know that there will be no consequences to what you do, somebody who really wants to do something bad would do anything. The book also described how the cult targets specific kinds of men, those who might even be vulnerable, those who might be financially struggling and wanting to tap into a community that was more upwardly mobile, those who were isolated, hungry for belonging or power. This group would bait their need and then make you pay for it later. This isn't just about a club, it fits every pattern of cult dynamics. And yet, because we're used to hearing the word Freemasonry, we brush it off. We treat it like some outdated thing with no effect on us. It had had a very real effect in my life and my children's. The author of the book wrote something that I'll never forget. Greed gets you in, and fear keeps you there. As I'm thinking about all this, I'm realizing that the true victims of all of this are the women and children, the ones who never took the oath, the ones who never consented to any of this. By virtue of the marriage covenant or family bloodline, the women and children would bear the weight of those curses. If he, my ex, had joined a cult, it wasn't just his problem. It meant the children and I were now entangled in it too. In many parts of the world, men in cults are required to sacrifice a loved one to rise in the ranks or gain power. But here in the West, we don't talk about it. We don't believe it. But look closely and you will still see the same patterns. A spouse suddenly falls ill. A child disappears or passes away suddenly. A family member or a loved one dies unexpectedly. To the outside world, it looks random. It looks tragic, but unrelated. But inside those homes, many wives are hunted, stalked, or driven to emotional or physical collapse. Children are often abused in secret. And sometimes the sacrifice isn't death at all, but a slow erasure of the person's life, their voice, their gifts, their calling, and their name. They are drained spiritually until there is nothing left. And from the outside, it just looks like she, quote unquote, fell apart. The lazy listener would assume, well, maybe that's why the marriage ended. As I'm thinking through all of this, a part of me starts to get angry while I'm reading this. I didn't sign up for any of this. I married a man, not a belief system clothed in secrecy. I said yes to building a family that would serve and honor the Lord, not to inheriting a battle with something dark and something ancient. And yet, here I was, watching my life unravel, watching my children get pulled into a war I didn't even know we were in. And finding out this would change the way I prayed. I realized then that we were not dealing with just marital problems or bad luck. We were dealing with something that uses men like him as pawns, while women and children pay the price. I looked up and I asked the Lord, again, keep showing me what I have not seen. We like to say that our battle is not against flesh and blood, but sometimes we misinterpret that to mean that we should do nothing, that we should just pray and wait. But that's not entirely biblical. This cult operated in both the spiritual and the physical. It tormented people with fear, intimidation, lies, and demonic power, but also through real-world destruction, legal attacks, financial ruin, violence, and death. It wasn't just spiritual warfare in the abstract. It was my husband's actual body that locked my children and I out from our home. It was his actual hands that kept my children's iPad and blocked them from being able to call me. It was his actual words that smeared me, his silence that abandoned us, and his actions that would trigger a storm. So no, I could not sit idle. This demanded both a spiritual and physical response, creating distance, praying for protection, and praying for deliverance, and preparing for what war might come. Because what came next, I could not afford to face alone.
By now it was becoming undeniable. Elle's ex wasn't just hiding secrets. He was quite possibly part of something much darker, something ancient, something organized, something spiritual. Every sign pointing to a cult. And here on If I Told You, we don't believe in coincidences. So when Elle started having vivid dreams, specific, unsettling visions that pointed to rituals and symbols she had never been taught, and then discovered those same images described in a book about cult initiation. That wasn't imagination. That was divine intelligence. This was no longer a matter of suspicion. This was confirmation. Yet there was no roadmap, no handbook, no friend she could call who had been through this before. When you're facing hidden knowledge that has stolen your children, the only way to fight is with light. She took Proverbs 3:5-6 seriously. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. And that's exactly what happened. The word became a lamp to her feet. Spiritual intelligence began to lead her. What to read, what to search, what her children might be experiencing, and how to pray. If she was dealing with a cult, what she didn't know yet was how that connected to the harm done to her child. But she was about to find out.
Almost as if to prove everything I was learning about how these groups operated, how they cover for one another and hide their crimes, I was watching our custody case unravel before my eyes. What should have been a straightforward forensic investigation dissolved into a storm of destruction. On July 21st, 2022, the original hearing regarding my daughter was abruptly canceled. Opposing counsel claimed to have COVID. By August 10th, 2022, CPS would pull out, and within a month, my first attorney would mysteriously withdraw from the case. If I had not begun to understand the patterns of cult systems, how they work in secrecy, and how they sabotage justice, I would have been completely disoriented. It would have made no sense. That same summer, I remember crying out to God with everything in me, begging for direction. Do you remember the double bind that I talked about earlier? That impossible place where every path forward feels like a trap. It felt like that's where I lived. People around me only saw the surface of what was going on, a quote-unquote messy custody battle, but I was staring straight into the eyes of the hidden hand moving in the dark. How was I supposed to fight this? Who do you even call when you suspect the corruption runs all the way through? Police, lawyers, guardian ad litems, judges, and trying to explain this to others was like explaining water to someone who's never been wet. Well-meaning people would say, well, just get a new lawyer, without the slightest context for what I was really facing. By then, I had become fully aware of the spiritual dimension of this battle, specifically the spirit of Jezebel. Jezebel controls by domination, by manipulation, and especially by cruel and sadistic means. Imagine this. A man possibly abuses a child or stages it and then goes to court to try and take that child from you. That is not just legal injustice, that is wickedness, and it was cloaked in a charming personality, wrapped in religious language, and reinforced by a Christian community that was spiritually asleep. So when people from our church or old friends would ask, hey, how's it going? I tried to answer without crumbling. It's a lot, I'd say. And they would nod. Yeah, divorces can be rough, but it's almost over, right? And crickets. What I wanted to say was, actually, he might be in a cult. There are demonic strongholds at work, and I don't know how to protect my kids without being labeled as overreacting. It felt bizarre to think that the truth in this case didn't make sense to anyone. But during that time, I wasn't fully alone. The prophetic community I was a part of became an important part of fighting this battle. I remember one afternoon I was torn over how to handle the visitation issue after what my daughter reported in the summer of 2022. I got on the phone with two women and we prayed for hours in tongues with scripture. Every few minutes, one of us would check in. Hey, what's the Lord saying? Are you seeing or hearing anything? Then one of the women shared a vision that I'll never forget. She said that she saw a hand in the spirit that was slowly twisting a corkscrew deep into a bottle. She said, the Lord is turning this screw all the way into this situation, so very deep, so that when he pulls it out, everything will come up with it. Nothing will be left hidden. That was the day that we began declaring Luke 8:17 over this whole situation. For there is nothing hidden that will not become evident, nor anything secret that will not be known and come out into the open. It was in that season, right after this moment, that God also reminded me to tell the story. So I began pulling out the notes that I had started back in December of 2021, and I began to write. At first, it was scattered, fragments of memories, prayers, and prophetic warnings. I didn't know what I was building. I only knew that I needed to save my children, and this is where the Lord told me to start. He said to teach my church about this, and so I did. What began as scribbled thoughts and midnight prayers turned into something I never could have imagined. It was the first issue of the If I Told You magazine. On July 21st, 2022, the original hearing about my daughter was abruptly canceled. This was the one where opposing counsel claimed that they had COVID, if you remember. Now, as unsettlingly as it was, it only confirmed what the Lord had been revealing to me. If he was in such a group, there would be all manner of twists and turns to avoid an actual trial from happening. The delays, the diversions, the constant obstacles, it was all part of their larger plan to keep the truth buried.
What if the stories we hide held the keys to our healing? What if the wounds that silenced us were actually evidence? If I Told You is not just a podcast. It's a magazine and a movement. A literary journal meets investigative review, built for survivors, advocates, and truth seekers. Inside each issue, we confront what many won't. Issues like the quiet epidemic of narcissistic abuse, the hidden toll of Freemasonry on women and children, the legal blind spots adult victims still fall through, the spiritual contracts that bind, and the practical steps to break them. And the stories, real stories, from real survivors, including Elle and her daughter. If I Told You doesn't just report pain, it traces the patterns, exposes the systems, and equips readers with tools to heal, to act, and to protect the next generation. Check the show notes for the link to purchase the magazine. Grab one for yourself and a friend, or work with us to have it sold in your local church bookstore. Reach out to our team for details on this. And now, back to the episode.
The more I studied, the more I saw the occult for what it was. Baal worship, just dressed up with different names for different groups. Behind every secret society, there was a hidden ritual, and it all traced back to the same thing. During this time, I locked in on the story of Gideon, who was living under oppression and was living in a nation that was suffering the consequences of idolatry, of worshiping Baal. The first thing that he was asked to do by the Lord was to tear down the altar. He was so afraid that it says that he tore down the altar at night. Yet, this very act was the first step to freedom. I chewed on this story, that even if my spouse had now joined into some secret society, the first thing I was going to have to do to protect my children and to protect myself was to come into a time of consecration, or a time of being set apart to really hear from the Lord. And it was going to have to be a time where I deeply and closely examined all of the iniquities or the generational sin that was in his family and mine. Because when we're talking about iniquity, it's not just one person's side that matters, it's both. And when it comes to praying for my children, it wouldn't just be something from my side of the family. I had to look from both angles. As I studied scripture, I also would come across real life stories. One day during this time in late 2022, I came across an interview with an author who had escaped the occult. After researching, I found her book, and when it came, I sat and read it in one day. What stood out the most was that she had been initiated through childhood sexual abuse. Her memories, many of them had been buried, had started to resurface as she got older through support and recovery. My mind immediately went to my children And this potential hypnosis session that the guardian ad litem had mandated, had my daughter been hypnotized or drugged, or was this some after effect of conditioning from whatever session this was? The woman in the book began to describe that what she had experienced and things that looked like this was SRA, satanic ritual abuse. This wasn't some fringe conspiracy theory or hippie communes playing with the occult. Satanic ritual abuse is deep, systematic spiritual abuse done in secret by secret groups, hidden even from the victims themselves. I also came across the story of a well-known actress in another country. She had been offered to the occult by her own boyfriend. What people don't realize is that when people join the occult and an individual wants to grow in rank or in power, they're often told to give over someone who they loved as a sacrifice. That could be a spouse, that could be your child, or if the person wasn't in a family, it could be their parent or a sibling. This woman talked about experiencing many of the things that I too had also experienced. The heavy spiritual warfare, the constant dreams. She talked about having issues with her phone, not being able to have help or receive help. She talked about any time that she tried to describe what was happening, people would shut her down. The next question that I asked of God was, what was this connection between the occult, sexual abuse, and narcissism? And literally less than an hour later, I came across an article. It explained that groups in the occult would use children for power, meaning they would commit sodomy on children to get occultic power. And in doing so, they would protect each other by all means. It's not just about evading the law. To them, they were protecting a power source. The article stated that most of these occult groups, they target doing this to children around the ages of 2 to 4, and that their goal was to mind control, in the sense that they wanted to be able to control how the child thought about what this abuse was, what it meant. They didn't want the child's alarm to be raised, so they would distort and pervert their understanding of what abuse was. After reading the article, I reached out to the author. He was an elderly man who was more than willing to speak. He shared his experiences of doing deliverance on many women who had escaped from the occult. He talked about how shocked they were, but what was all the same is that many of the women had been sodomized by their husbands, and many of them also had children that had been abused by the spouse. And then he said very gently to me, "You know, if he's done this to your daughter, it's likely that he's done this to you." I thought about the countless times that he preferred anal sex over vaginal, and how that seemed to be the thing that he got a rise out of. This is where ignorance had been the chink in my armor. It had been the thing that had kept me blind. I'd only ever been with him. I had no context that such an act had spiritual implications. I was beginning to also understand in a way that just as you think about with children and abuse, that even the act of sodomizing one's spouse, this was bigger than being on the down low. This was grooming. This was a cycle, something that had likely been passed off as normal, or may have been done to him by someone or anyone else. How many other women had suffered through this, but didn't know how to talk about it? After this conversation, I just wept again. There's nowhere that you can run from this. With everything I was learning, by this point, I knew that the Lord had his hands on us, but I also knew that things would have to happen a different way, a drastic way, in order for a different outcome. There are many who try to come out from the occult, but legally, they're hammered when it comes to fighting for their rights or fighting for their children. At first I thought there's nowhere that you can run from this. And if I was correct, they were likely going to try to turn all the hearings we would have going forward in his favor. They would try to close it and then try to give him rights to visit and erase any trace of abuse and help him in every step of the way. That hand that I had talked about so frequently. By late September 2022, exactly what I just said to you happened. The hearing would take place. This was the one where the judge reinstated visitation, the one where they had me cross-examine him. And just as I had feared, they gave visitation back to him. It's one thing to discern or suspect something, but it's a whole other thing when it happens, when you're standing in the moment that you once dreaded. After that September 2022 hearing, I was numb for weeks. This was too smooth, too calculated. It felt as if we had now walked through a gauntlet of abuse that many other women and children had walked before us, and sadly, many would walk after us as well. As a mom, the only thing that you think about is protecting your children, and you will shout from the rooftops and deal with any system to bring them back. And now that I was understanding that I wasn't just dealing with a toxic divorce, I knew that how I moved needed to be so divinely led, because I had asked so many people for advice on lawyers. This wasn't just about getting the right lawyer, and this wasn't just about following tips on how to deal with the narcissist in court. I was not dealing with just him in court. I was dealing with the system, with situations that very few could understand. And what was at stake was the protection of my children. The only way I can explain how I felt after the conversation about the article is by referring to a passage in Ezekiel chapter 1. And the verse says, "So the Spirit lifted me up and took me away, and I went in bitterness and in the anger of my spirit, with the strong hand of the Lord upon me. I came to the exiles at Tel Abib, who dwelt by the river Kabar, and for 7 days I sat where they sat, and remained there among them, overwhelmed." I had just watched God immediately answer a prayer regarding needing information to connect the dots. I had experienced his presence, and yet the revelation left me angry and overwhelmed. Like Ezekiel, I literally could not speak for several days. Regardless of how I felt, though, the Lord would keep showing me. The evidence that this was some backlash from likely occult attachment was clear. It seemed to invade through our dreams, through the words of others, and through the eyes of my children. The horror wasn't just something external. It was happening all around us. Throughout this time, my children and I were growing deeper and stronger in the Lord, and we often prayed together, worshiped together, and read the Word together. One of the things that started is that they began to also have dreams of what was happening around us. In November 2022, my youngest daughter kept having repeated dreams about a large frog on her head. Now, I'm not one to ignore dreams, and so when she kept repeating this, I paid attention and we began to pray into it, all of us. She described it as a large frog that didn't just ribbit, but it barked loudly. She says that it would seem to stay stuck on her head no matter how she shoot it off. Spiritually speaking, frogs can represent unclean spirits and sorcery. We see this from Revelation 16:13. I saw 3 unclean spirits that looked like frogs coming out of the mouths of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. And the fact that this frog was consistently jumping on her head symbolized an attack on her thoughts, her memories, her mind. Remember what I shared in earlier episodes about the hypnosis sessions my kids told me, and even her presenting like she was having gaps in her memory. In one particular dream that stood out, she stated that she and her siblings were playing around in the living room where her dad lives. She says that some of her father's family members came to the front door with other men dressed in suits that she did not recognize. They were calling her name to come and enter into a car that was parked on the driveway. She went to look for where her father was, and her father was sitting in a separate bedroom with headphones on, looking the other way and staring at the wall. What haunts me is the last one, is where her father was there, seeing someone else trying to take her, but he had headphones on and was turned away. It shows that he is aware of what was happening to our children, but was ignoring it, and worse, was allowing it to happen. In late 2022 and in November as well, my youngest daughter had another dream where she and her father were being buried into holes in the ground, some in the backyard and some inside the house. She stated that these holes were full of broken glass and toys like Barbie dolls. She said that her older sister and brother didn't fall into the holes and were trying to help her out of them. Once they were able to bring her out of them, she noticed that there was a man that was there in front of the house. She called him the Magic Man and called him a bad Jesus. She said, "Mommy, like you know how there's the angel versus the devil? This one was the devil." She stated that the Magic Man said that he had dug those holes and that he was the one that gave her father a place to live. He also told her that he had put magic on the house so that he can take it far, far away. Then she saw the Magic Man pick up the house and run away with it. She said the Magic Man sounded like a wolf. I want to remind you that these are dreams that my children are having. So the fact that these were detailed dreams in this way was telling that the Lord was not only just speaking to me, he was having personal encounters with my children, even in their dreams. This was not just mercy, it was an act of safety as well as, I believe, deliverance for my children. I wasn't just fighting the potential abuse of my daughter, but also the fact that he would try to bring our kids into some kind of alignment with beliefs that we did not hold as a family. Every visit there, especially as he denied them contact with me, my mind would go into a tailspin. Because, spiritually, there's a war that's happening against my kids now. I had taught them to pray. I taught them how to declare the word. I taught them how to take communion. But when they go, you just hope that they remember. And you hope that they are given the fair chance to actually live out what you have taught them and to live out the word and to know the Holy Spirit. What's worse again is that all of this is happening in plain sight. Because you see images of my kids with their father, it becomes hard to reconcile. You mean all of this happened and then this just looks so normal? This is by intent. It is cognitive dissonance. If the outside world just saw him taking them to church or seeing that they were behaved, they would miss entirely the onslaught that was happening behind the veil. I feel led right now to declare. We see in scripture that it says that any parent, any person that keeps a child from being able to come into the presence of the Lord, that it is better for them that a millstone be hung around their neck. May they be judged for even attempting or thinking that they could snatch these precious ones from the hand of God. I declare Isaiah 49:13 over my children and yours if this story is something that you can relate to this, that from eternity to eternity, that God will always be God and he will forever be God. Let no one snatch these ones out of his hands. Let no one undo what he has said he will do. Let no one undo what he has begun in my children and yours. Let no one undo their destinies or their calling. Let no one undo their fire and zeal for the true and living God. Let no one undo their attempt to worship. And if they dare try, may they find themselves fighting against the living God. And may the Lord of angel armies answer by fire. May he set that person on a dark and slippery path. For without cause, they have laid their net for these innocent ones, and they have dug a pit for them. So may they become entangled in the net that they have laid, and may they fall into the pit that they have dug. It wasn't just my children that were dreaming. It was other people as well. People who did not even know the full story. People who had not even been told the full details were also having dreams. There was one friend who dreamt a very detailed dream about seeing him and myself in court. That there was a way that he had coded his words in order to avoid being seen as lying under oath. Another saw him with a child who no one knew about. Over and over, these dreams would come from people who had no reason to imagine such things, But I believe that the Lord was showing not just only myself and my kids, but other people who were willing to allow the Lord to speak to them. Then in the spring or summer of 2023, I was dropping my kids off for visitation with their dad. When the kids entered his car, their father immediately grabbed a blue and white beaded necklace and put it on my youngest daughter. Now, these beads were like medium-sized wooden or plastic beads, and in the middle, it had tiles that spelled out his name. I thought it was odd that it said his name and not hers. I asked him immediately what that was. He said that she had made it. Now, that didn't make sense either because the kids had just come off of a holiday, if I remember correctly, and they had been with me for 2.5 weeks straight. So when would that have happened? And why does it have his name on it, not hers? I knew the meaning of jewelry that was not normal or godly. I sat in the car afterward just praying in tongues and praying and breaking any meaning of what that necklace could mean. Fast forward a year later, I was in South Africa and I saw a woman with a similar blue and white beaded necklace and bracelet. Unashamedly, I beckoned her over and I asked her, "Excuse me, what does your necklace mean? And what is the significance of the colors?" She looked at me and got quiet, as if unsure if she should really answer me or not. She said, "Oh, do you like it?" I said, "No, not really. I'm just curious what it means." She exhaled and said, "Well, it's like if you want to be a sangoma." She said the blue and white is like mermaid spirits. It helps to bring wealth and money. She began to drone on, but I droned out, knowing that this exactly affirmed what I had been discerning about what that necklace meant past year. Mermaid spirits, as she talked about, are marine spirits, demonic principalities that empower occult practices and witchcraft. As it says in Ezekiel chapter 13, verse 18, "Woe to the women who sew magic charms on their wrist and make veils for the heads of people of every height in order to ensnare their souls. Will you ensnare the souls of my people, but preserve your own? You have profaned me among my people for handfuls of barley and scraps of bread. By lying to my people who would listen, you have killed those who should not have died and have spared those who should not have lived. Therefore, this is what the Lord God says. See, I am against the magic charms with which you ensnare souls like birds, and I will tear them from your arms. So I will free the souls you have ensnared like birds. I will also tear off your veils and deliver my people from your hands, so that they will no longer be prey in your hands. Then you will know that I am the living God. May God judge the hand of any parent, grandparent, relative that uses jewelry as spiritual leashes or as deceptive means of initiation. By virtue of this word, may God free the souls of every child, young and old, who are ensnared by virtue of gifts from parents, whether it be jewelry, clothing, food. May God judge your hidden works and expose you for the wickedness that you have done or attempted to do. Let me say this, in this day and age, there are adults who are doing this to children, and they're not just using jewelry. They will use certain brands of clothing as a way of doing the same thing. Brands that you think are innocent, brands that may even have an air of supposed Christianity. For those who are operating in this deception, every dollar spent on purchasing, every hour spent in coordination, may that trouble recoil back on you. May the Lord nullify, cancel, and abolish every unlawful, illegal initiation of innocent children without their knowing. May the Lord God deliver his children and cause them to escape the snare. May our children escape every snare of the enemy. I declare a divine escape from the hidden plans of these cults. The injustice we were facing was clear, and because my children know Christ, they wanted to stand up to fight back. During one visitation exchange, I witnessed something incredibly brave. They were in the car with their father, begging me not to make them go. Then, in a bold moment, my daughter unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out of the car. She looked at him and she said, "No, I'm not going." I watched her, my oldest daughter, this brave girl, stand up to him. Regardless of how you feel about this, I watched her push back. I watched her believe God. I embraced her as she wept. My youngest then began to follow suit, and that was when her father began to seethe. He barked at them to get back in the car. My oldest daughter held me tighter. His face shifted towards her. His voice deepened. He stared her down with the venom that I felt in my bones. People often hear stories like this, and they quickly suggest mutual co-parenting, urging both parties to try harder. But this wasn't that. This was a man we were confronting about potential issues of abuse with my youngest and likely involvement in the occult. My daughter was brave that day. My God, she was brave. But I also knew that there would be a cost. In families like this, defiance isn't tolerated, it is punished. And in that moment, I knew that she had just become a target, that they would likely use her against myself, because in those kinds of systems, resistance marks you. Despite the growing signs that this whirlwind bore the fingerprints of occult oppression, I often found myself still wondering, did he join this thing willingly? Was he forced? Or was he tricked into it? Not because I was trying to defend him. By all means, no. We are dealing with serious issues regarding the potential abuse of my daughter. But understanding how he got into such a group would help me understand what spiritual ground we were standing on all these years, and most importantly, what his true intentions are now with our children. Because there's a difference between someone seduced into darkness and someone who runs towards it. There's a difference between deception and devotion. And knowing which it is doesn't change the danger, but it helps you know what kind of war you're really in. Is this a man who's a pawn, or is he a priest in their system? Knowing that could help me understand what kind of protection, prayer, and posture this battle would require. I hadn't known how to explain this to anyone until one morning during a prayer service. Midway through the session, the pastor paused and declared with force, "Look at the allegations they laid against you. They pushed you out of your husband's house. A woman has been pushed out of her home due to false slander. Let there be a reversal. The Lord expose and reverse, expose and reverse." I froze. It was like he had reached into my chest and pulled out the exact wounds and words. I was watching a custody case crumble under intimidation tactics that I know were engineered and designed to punish me for telling the truth about what happened to my daughter. I had been pushed out, not just from my home, but from the lives of my children. Then, almost immediately after that word, the pastor shifted again. Before you realized what happened, you had gone too far. They threatened you. For any man who has gone too far into diabolical schemes, you were told that it was too late and that you can't recant. The devil is a liar. May every covenant, every link with them, whatever you gave them, every incantation, every hex, curse, or spell be broken and revoked in Jesus' name. I sat there undone. That prayer sounded like it was crafted from my unanswered questions with God. What if that was him? What if he got caught in something before he even realized how deep it went? And what if he was threatened? What if he tried to back out, but the cost of leaving was too high? The thing about it is this: even if he was seduced into darkness, such cults still demand certain things to be done, including the abuse of children, which I have talked to you about earlier. And what if, because of all that, now my children and I were the collateral damage because of a decision he had made? I was here battling for truth, smeared and silenced, caught in a storm I did not create, all while the gates of hell had been quietly opened over my family by the very one who was supposed to protect it. Maybe he didn't mean to join, but either way, we were the ones who were left holding the broken pieces.
What that pastor declared that day wasn't just a prayer, but a prophetic word that reflected everything Elle hadn't yet said out loud. It named the invisible war that had hit her home. It made spiritual sense of what had looked like legal chaos, emotional devastation, and family disintegration. And while she was standing on the way to that revelation, in the certainty of God's word, her children were taken, in plain sight, by the very person or people now suspected had opened the door to all of this. What came next was a series of hearings where the truth was buried, while her kids were kidnapped under the banner of law. So let's keep listening, because you're about to see what it looks like when darkness dresses itself in robes and gavels and dared to call it justice.
It was October and November 2023. The final hearings were set. After years of spiritual war and courtroom chaos, this was supposed to be the end. From July 2021 until now, we have been through hell. That first morning with my youngest daughter in our master bedroom, May 2022 when my daughter first spoke up, the car crash in the spring of 2023, and the hypnosis sessions that my kids told me about, and the persistent question of was my ex involved in the occult. One hearing was to be in person, and the last one on November 16th, 2023 was on Zoom. When I logged in that afternoon, the virtual gallery was packed with his friends and family. Now, I didn't even know guests could be on this. In just 30 minutes, the judge would state to the audience that the kids were to go live with their father and that restrictions were placed on me as to how I could contact them, even their school. And like that, when the kids went in that afternoon, their father would take their iPads from them, severing our only way of communicating. I watched it all unfold like a carefully rehearsed play, and just like that, he had kidnapped my children in plain sight. This wasn't court. This was spiritual theater. It was a staged exchange. And now I know that I am dealing with someone that was led by something darker. Some of you listening to this, you know me. You have walked beside me. You have prayed with me, or you have watched from afar. And still this is happening right in front of you, in front of people who also call themselves believers. And no one said anything, and no one stopped it. Nothing felt real in that moment. The ground beneath me was gone. These are my children. The ones the Lord knit in my womb. The ones I prayed over before they were born. The ones I watch every of their first teeth come in. The ones who I pack their lunches and ask what snacks they want in their lunch bags. The ones who we read books together and we tell bedtime stories. The ones that we memorize scripture together and do their homework together. When I told you earlier in some of the earlier episodes, and that he would try to erase me from their lives completely, I hope you hear me now. This was never just a custody case. And it was not just a messy divorce. This is what it looks like when the occult hides in plain sight. This is what it looks like when dark systems masquerade as legal systems. Because behind the scenes, there are covenants at play, and the darkness doesn't just want access, it wants to transfer blame. It wants to take what should fall on the guilty and drop it on the innocent. It is like spiritual scapegoating, where someone else's sins are quietly pinned on you, and no one even realizes that it's happening. What happened that day is an exchange. It is a twisted inversion where outcomes are reversed. As it pertains to my children, what was meant for me in that courtroom was handed to him, and what was meant for him was handed to me. And the sickness of it all is that we hear stories like this and we say, wow, that's just life. Or we say, well, that's how family court works. But I'm here to say that's not. In fact, this miscarriage of justice only confirms something deeper, that what my daughter said happened in the summer of 2021 and spring of 2022, it was real. That what my children described about hypnosis and the fear that they had, that it was real. I've been the one at home with my children their whole lives. Every appointment, every school, every bedtime, every prayer. And now, because of someone else's actions, because they have aligned themselves with something else that is dark, everything has flipped upside down. 1 Samuel 30:3-6.
When David and his men came to the city, they found it burned down, and their wives and sons and daughters had been taken captive. So David and the troops with him lifted up their voices and wept until they had no strength left to weep. I had no more strength left.
What do you do when the ground gives way beneath you? When what you thought was a system of justice becomes a stage for betrayal? When you watch your children disappear, not into the night, but in plain sight and no one seems to blink? This was never just a legal battle. It was never just a custody case. This was a spiritual war, cloaked in courtrooms, hidden behind family photos, masked by titles, traditions, and polite silence. From whispered dreams to shattered verdicts, from brave resistance to sinister reversals. This season has pulled back the veil on something ancient, something dark, and something far more common than we'd like to admit. But the story doesn't end here, because what happens when the dust settles? What does Elle believe now, after everything she's seen and lived? What do you do when the ground gives way beneath you? When what you thought was a system of justice becomes a stage for betrayal? When you watch your children disappear, not into the night, but in plain sight and no one seems to blink? This was never just a legal battle. It was never just a custody case. This was a spiritual war, cloaked in courtrooms, hidden behind family photos, masked by titles, traditions, and polite silence. From whispered dreams to shattered verdicts, from brave resistance to sinister reversals. This season has pulled back the veil on something ancient, something dark, and something far more common than we'd like to admit. But the story doesn't end here, because what happens when the dust settles? What does Elle believe now, after everything she's seen and lived?
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. Before we go, it's time for Q&A, where we ask you questions to reflect on and ask for answers that could make a big difference. Here's your question to ponder. Do you have a spouse that was in Freemasonry or had to deal with one through the family courts? What was your experience and how did you deal? And here's our ask. Do you know anything that might shed light on Elle's case? If you have any clues, tips, or answers that could help our storyteller, please don't hesitate to share. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Head to our Wisha page at www.weza.com, If I Told You Show, or click the link on our podcast page. There you can drop a text message, audio note, or video response. Each week, we'll sum up your responses to the reflection question in an exclusive after show for deep dives on the week's themes. And any tips or clues you share for the case will be kept confidential. Until next time, remember, your voice matters, your actions count, and your instincts are more powerful than you think. Till next time,